Hello, tiny people. Here we go again. Time for another history lesson here. This one is on Petersburg and Atlanta. And if I could pull this off so that it looks like anything, I will be more than impressed with myself. Well, this is going to be a long and a serious film, so sit down. Let's see what's going to be happening. I have to introduce the cast. There will be uh, Eleanor Baer as the Army of the Potomac. She'll be joined by Eeyore as the Army of Northern Virginia, but that will only be for a short time. If you recall, what was happening was the Army of the Potomac was one of one of six armies moving all at once against the Confederacy. This was coming down, look at this, I can throw my arm in here, coming down from Virginia with George Gordon Meade still in command, but Ulysses Grant was along with him. So really it was Grant's army. And they had 180,000 men altogether. There were 100,000 in the Army of the Potomac, plus an army of about 40,000 on either side of them. And they were going to march on down and just overwhelm Robert E. Lee's army. They were going toward Richmond, remember, but they didn't care about Richmond. They cared about killing Confederates. That is extremely, extremely important. Well, they went over, and it all began on May 4th, 1864. The army started marching. Remember, the other three armies are the men under William Tecumseh Sherman and the two armies supporting his over on the west part of the country. And they are after Joe Johnston's army, heading toward Atlanta. But again, the idea is kill Confederates. The ways to beat an army or to beat an enemy is to kill its economy. That was the Anaconda Plan, and now to kill the army. They started on May 4th, 1864, and on May 5th and 6th, the first battles happened, called the Wilderness. Now, if you think about Lee's plan, and again, Lee was just a fantastic general, what he did was he said, wow, this guy is coming at me with unbelievable numbers of people. And so he picked this thick woods in Northern Virginia, and he said, okay, he's going to come through here. If you look at that picture, you can't march 180,000 men through there and keep any kind of organization. They would have to stick to the one big road leading through. And that was like trying to pass liquid through the mouth of a bottle. They had to thin out and only a few at a time, relatively. So that was Lee's plan. And in the Wilderness, he could neutralize the numbers. And Robert E. Lee did a fantastic job, completely defeated Ulysses Grant the first time they went out. And what happened was the North lost 17,000, the South lost 11,000. And then the biggest step of the war. Oh, hello. The biggest step of the war. Grant started coming down towards Richmond. Whoa. He's defeated by Robert E. Lee. Every other Northern commander had turned around and retreated back to Washington. Regrouped, they got a new commander, Lincoln picked one out, and then they came down and were defeated again. Grant came down and he was defeated. I mean, he lost 17,000 men, Lee only lost 11,000. And Grant went back and said, whoa, this guy is good. That was an incredible battle he fought. That was really brilliant. But and this is the greatness of Grant. Grant simply marched around to the side, turned back towards Richmond, and continued on. He is the first Northern general to understand that Richmond isn't the target. The target is Lee's army. And in order to kill Lee's army, he has to keep fighting Lee. So they break off. Again, they're right back into heavy battles. A particularly hard one was from May 8th to 19th at a place called Spotsylvania. And Spotsylvania had I need my cast, had a day of hand-to-hand combat. And it was particularly vicious. And the armies did a very strange thing. My two armies are facing each other. And remember, when you look at an army, it is one side, this would be Eeyore's left arm. So this would be Eeyore's left flank. This would be Eeyore's right arm. So this is Eeyore's right flank. There's the center of the line, the two flanks, the two sides. And as the two armies faced each other, each general decided to make the same attack on the right flank. So one general said, I'm attacking on my right flank. And the other general said, hey, I'm attacking on my right flank. And the two armies, when the battle began, actually turned around 180 degrees. So they wound up in each other's trenches. Kind of an incredible coincidence. Again, the North lost 17,000 men. The South lost 9,000. Ulysses Grant said, man, this guy's good. And then he turned and continued to march toward Richmond. Now, at this point in time, the arithmetic of war was working because this is where Robert E. Lee received the last of his regular replacements. From now on, they'd have to pirate soldiers out of other armies. Just say, hey, your army gets smaller because Lee needs more guys. So at this point in time, Lee gets his last replacements. The end of May to June, they fought at a place called Cold Harbor. Again, 10 days, terrible losses, but Grant didn't really care. I mean, of course, he was a humane man. He didn't like to sacrifice soldiers, men's lives, but Grant understood something very important, and that is he had to keep fighting. All right. Let's get myself adjusted here again. Oh, I tell you, this technology, Mr. Holman, is something special. At this point in time, Benjamin Beast Butler gets tied up on the peninsula, and he won't get free for the rest of the war. And I know I told you guys before that Bella was writing down, Bella Butler, Mrs. Beast Butler, Mrs. Benjamin Butler. But I actually, when I said that lesson, I received cards and letters from Lily Brooke, Mina, and Riley because they were, in fact, insanely jealous. So in the spirit of Ben Butler, he's not alive anymore, of course, but if he were, I'm sure he would send them a card saying something like this. So girls, don't be jealous. Ben Butler was a heck of a human being. All right. Ooh, now we get to look again. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're back again, this time at the walled city of Petersburg, right here on my very own battlefield table. Today we have the rebels in red. Notice the fortifications around the city of Petersburg. See, it even says Petersburg. And the Confederates were inside. After Cold Harbor, Robert E. Lee realized that U.S. Grant was not going to leave him alone, so he had to get into some place where he was sheltered. He ran into the fortified city of Petersburg to kind of catch his breath and say, whoa, how do I get away from this guy so I can continue to fight? Grant laid siege. He surrounded the city of Petersburg, trapping Robert E. Lee's army inside and making sure that they did not get any more supplies. But Grant had just spent the previous summer at Vicksburg. He had just lived through a long siege, and he hated the idea of having another one. Ulysses Grant wanted to fight. He wanted to kill Confederates, and the idea of sitting around waiting to starve them out was just repugnant to him. So, a group of Pennsylvania miners were attached to Grant's army. When I say miners, I don't mean people under 21. I'm talking about people who are digging in the ground, trying to find things, working in mines. And they came up with the idea. They said, hey, General Grant, we're miners. We dig underground. You know what we could do? We could dig a tunnel from where our lines are all the way down underground to the walled area of Petersburg. Then you get your army, gather them together, and the green guys are the Union soldiers. You gather a large portion of your army together, you set them out front, you have them lie down, and right at dawn, when you give us the signal to attack, we will detonate the explosives we put in that mine tunnel. It'll blow a big gaping hole into the walls of Petersburg, and then our men can rush forward and take Petersburg. Grant loved the idea. Grant thought this was fantastic. Unfortunately, when they were little tiny miners, they did not have anybody like Mr. Arvold to direct them through their mathematical studies because they made a horrid miscalculation. They dug the tunnel and they didn't make it long enough so that when they laid the charges, they were not under the walls of Petersburg. They were in front of the walls of Petersburg. When the explosion happened, instead of blowing apart the walls of Petersburg, they blew a trench, a crater right in front of the walls, making it actually deeper. And when the Union soldiers rushed forward, they rushed into the crater. And the walls were now not only just as high as they had been, but they were as deep as the crater, that much higher. Now, if you guys saw the little film clip from Cold Mountain, if your parents did share that with you, please try to visualize what I'm talking about. If not, you're just going to have to go on my words. It's called The Agony in the Crater. And what happened was these Union soldiers rushed forward and simply were pinned against the wall. As the first ones rushed in, they were all excited, thought they'd get a chance to get in there and take the city and be big heroes. And they ran into a very, very, very tall wall. And with all those people pushing and shoving behind them, they were soon trapped in, just pushed against each other before the people in the back realized what was happening and allowed them a little bit of room to get out. It was called the Agony in the Crater because it was pretty much just target practice for the Confederates. Yes, some of them had been killed along the defenses, but for a great many of them, they were still alive and just fine. And now here were those Union soldiers packed shoulder to shoulder inside the crater, and there was no way to fire a gun or throw a bullet or shoot a cannon or anything else without hitting many of them. Now, let's talk specifically about that film clip if you saw it, because I think there's some very good things in there. First of all, I really like the scene in there where there's the African American who's in the Union uniform, the Army of the North, and there's the Cherokee Indian who's in the Army of the South. Because again, oftentimes we're so simplistic in our view of it and say, oh, well, the people in the North were fighting for freedom. But remember which government had taken away the land of the Cherokee and put them on the Trail of Tears. The Cherokee and a lot of other Indian tribes sided with the South. As a matter of fact, there was a Cherokee Confederate general named Stand Watie, and the Confederacy recognized the Indian tribes and valued them as allies a lot more than the North had. So both of those people, the Black Union soldier and the Native American Confederate, were each fighting for what they considered their freedoms and their rights. Then you saw them at the end, and really at the beginning too, when it was just the Confederate bodies, stripping the dead, because the Confederacy did not have the industrial ability to clothe its soldiers. So when it came to footwear or clothing, they simply stripped it from the dead. They'd, of course, take the Confederate uniforms, but they'd also take the Union uniforms because they were much better made and much more available. Finally, here's a kind of a serious story here. I play around sometimes with these films and all, but we're not going to get a chance this year to do an essay that I've done for years for the Marine Corps League. And what it is a chance to express patriotism and realize what price has been paid for your freedoms. There is a man who's come in, he's passed on now in just the last couple of years. His name was Clayton Chipman, and he was a Marine veteran. He was shot on Iwo Jima in World War II. And he came in for years and talked to the kids, and he brought in a lot of other Marines, active duty and old veterans. And they spoke about the things that they had seen and done. And the way Mr. Chipman made me believe it was, if you think about going out to dinner with your family, let's suppose all of the family that lives with you in your house goes out, and so does your aunt and uncle and all their kids. And you go out to a really nice restaurant, and the bill comes, and your uncle reaches over and says, I've got that. And you go, woohoo! Hey, a free meal. But it's not a free meal. It's just that someone else paid for it for you. Well, that's the way it is with your freedoms. They weren't free. Someone else paid for them for you. And You'll see as you get a little bit older, I hope, some of the sacrifices that have been made, and you'll come to understand what a terrible thing war really is. I hope that film clip brought that home to you, but I just want to share one story from Mr. Chipman, how awful and how desensitizing war was. Now, he was in the Pacific in World War II, as I said, and they were fighting the Japanese. And he came in with a few of his friends from a patrol, and they came in, they hadn't had a hot meal in a long time. And this was a place where they were taking care of a lot of the grubbier part of the work that the Marine Corps did. And Mr. Chipman and his friends, they got themselves filled up. They got a nice plate full of hot food, and there was no place to sit. So they actually went over and sat down on some dead Japanese people and had their lunch. And I just want you to strike home with you how much a person has to give up to go and fight a war, really of their humanity. Now, Mr. Chipman was a fine individual, a wonderful person. He was a teacher. He became a school principal. He cared and loved for his kids. But while he was fighting the war, he had to be kind of a different sort of an animal. Well, that was the army in the East down in Petersburg. But something else was going on very similar out in the West, and that was Sherman, William Tecumseh Sherman, the Union general, had chased Joe Johnston over toward Atlanta, and Joe Johnston ran his Confederate army into Atlanta, and it was much the same thing. The Confederates were inside the fortified city, the Union surrounded them. Now, Joe Johnston realized, hey, we have an opportunity here. It's summer 1864. Abraham Lincoln was elected president in the fall of 1860. He's up for re-election. And his opponent is none other than George Brinton McClellan, the former commander of the Army of the Potomac. He was running as the Democratic candidate in 1864. And Joe Johnston said, look, Mr. President, speaking to Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, whom he considered his president, he said, look, Mr. President, we can still win this war. I think being realistic, we can't win it militarily, but we can still win it politically. And what in fact he said was, let's keep this going with the siege of Atlanta and the siege of Petersburg. All we have to do is hold out, and it's going to look so desperate. Nothing's happening. Lives are being lost. Fortunes are being spent, that the people of the North will vote Abraham Lincoln out of office. He won't be president anymore. And McClellan, when he becomes president, will sue for peace. He had already said that he would look for an honorable peace. So they thought, wow, we can win this war. And remember what it took to win the war. This is important. When a battle starts out, a battle, a war, a fight, what's the goal? The goal of the South was to become a separate nation. The only way for them to win the war was to become a separate nation. The North wanted to unite all of the states again. The only way they were going to be able to do that was to go down south and recapture the Confederate states. Well, in Atlanta, there was a new general, a Confederate named John Bell Hood, and he was missing an arm and missing a leg. He had been in a lot of battles. And John Bell Hood was a bit of a gambler. He thought, you know what? Joe Johnston, actually, I didn't tell you that, but Joe Johnston was fired because Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, said, nah, I don't want this guy. I want someone who will give me a positive defense of Atlanta. I want someone who will attack Sherman. Now, remember, Joe Johnston and then John Bell Hood, their Confederate army was about 60,000 people. Sherman had 100,000 men and another 40,000 in each of two supporting armies. He had 180,000 men. It was 3-1. And Jefferson Davis said, hey, go out there and attack these guys. You can do it. Well, John Bell Hood was a gambler. As a matter of fact, before the war, he had once bet $2,500 on a hand of poker, and he didn't even have a pair. Now, let's put that in today's dollars. That's about $75,000 he'd bet on a hand of poker without even having a pair. Well, John Bell Hood did just what Jefferson Davis wanted. He ran out, he fought a battle, and he got his tail kicked. And so Atlanta was lost in September of 1864. The Union took it, the Confederacy lost it, and that was perfect timing for the news to go back up north just in time for Abraham Lincoln's election. He won re-election and became for a second term the President of the United States. Tiny people, it has been a pleasure. I miss you all very much. Peter, thank you for lending me your face. Hasta la vista, babies.